I never thought this day would come, the day when the house I had lived in for over 50 years would feel alien, like a stranger's possession. The mansion on 14th Street had been my sanctuary, my fortress, my universe. Every corner held a memory: the delicate scratches on the oak floors where my children had played tag, the faded wallpaper that smelled faintly of vanilla and dust, the library where I had spent countless evenings reading by candlelight. Now all of it felt like a ghost, a cruel echo of a life that had been stolen. It started with David, my grandson. I had trusted him. I had believed naively that the blood that ran through our veins would shield me from betrayal, but that trust had been shattered. One morning I woke to find the locks changed, the gates locked tight, and a single, cold envelope on the front porch. I recognized David's handwriting immediately. My hands shook as I tore it open. The words were brief, cruelly clinical. The mansion had been sold. By him, my own grandson. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled backward, the letter slipping from my trembling hands and fluttering to the ground like a wounded bird. My chest tightened. My lungs burned. The world tilted, and for a moment I thought I might collapse on the cold stone steps. And yet, amid the chaos of shock and grief, something inside me stirred. A tiny, dangerous spark. Anger, yes, but more than that, a cunning awareness that those who underestimated me would pay the price. They thought 73 years meant weakness. They thought age brought frailty. They were wrong. I spent that first night walking the perimeter of the mansion, peering through the cracks in the high iron fence, my breath fogging in the cold night air. The garden, once meticulously tended, had been allowed to decay into chaos: tangled roses, weeds taller than my knees, statues half swallowed by creeping ivy. The sight, oddly, only strengthened my resolve. If they believed they could erase me, they were about to learn a lesson in underestimation. Inside the house, they had begun their changes. I watched from the shadows as strangers, people I didn't know, people who had no idea they were stepping into my domain, moved through the rooms. Their laughter grated against my nerves like metal on stone. They rearranged the furniture, discarded items I had cherished for decades, and placed their unfamiliar scent in my home, as if that could erase the years I had lived here. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug crescents into my palms. I whispered to the darkness, to the night, to the moon itself, "They will regret this, every single one of them." And though my voice trembled, it carried the weight of a promise I intended to keep. Sleep was impossible. My mind raced with plans, with memories, with the bitter taste of betrayal. I recalled how David had been a curious, bright boy, always at my side in the garden, asking questions about the roses and the library and the paintings that lined the hallway. I had taught him about trust, about honor, about respect. And yet, here he was, stripping me of everything I had built. Morning arrived with a cold, grey light. I watched from my small apartment across the street, my eyes never leaving the mansion. I saw David arrive, impeccably dressed, a smug smile plastered on his face. He was proud, and that pride would be his undoing. I needed to be patient, to observe, to gather every detail. Revenge was not about anger, it was about timing, precision, and the element of surprise. I began to make notes. Every schedule, every pattern, every weakness. I learned the comings and goings of the new occupants, the way they neglected security cameras, the times when the house seemed almost abandoned. Each observation fed into my plan, each detail another weapon in the arsenal of justice I was assembling. But it wasn't just David I had to consider. There was Karen, his accomplice, sweet-talking, manipulative, the type who could charm a judge out of a verdict. She had laughed when the estate had changed hands, a high-pitched, cruel sound that cut through the evening air and lodged itself in my mind. And Mandy who had encouraged David, who had whispered in his ear, who had fueled his greed. Every one of them would have to face the consequences of underestimating me. Even as the fire of vengeance burned inside me, I found myself haunted by flashes of my own past. I remembered the nights when my husband had passed away, leaving me to manage the estate alone. I remembered the loneliness, the fear, and the relentless work that had built this mansion into the legacy it was. And I remembered telling myself in the dark hours of the night that I would never allow anyone to diminish my life's work again. The first real opportunity came 2 weeks later. I noticed the gardener, an old man with arthritis who often complained about long hours, had a penchant for leaving the back gate unsecured when he went for his lunch break. I watched him, memorized his habits, and that night under the cover of darkness I slipped past the fence. The thrill of being inside my home again, of touching the familiar walls and walking the marble halls, was intoxicating. I felt alive, more alive than I had in years. I moved cautiously, methodically. Every creak of the floorboards was a symphony in my ears, every shadow a potential threat. But as I reached the grand staircase, I froze, David was standing there. He hadn't heard me enter, but his presence was undeniable, a dark silhouette against the dim light of the chandelier. Our eyes met, and in that instant I saw a flicker of recognition and fear. Not fear of me, not yet, but the first tremor of doubt. "Grandma," his voice was uncertain, faltering. I didn't know you were, I mean." I didn't answer. I let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, until it pressed against him like the walls themselves. Then I spoke, softly, deliberately. "You thought you could take this from me, David. You thought I was finished. But you're about to learn that some fires never burn out." His face paled. He stepped back instinctively, and for the first time I felt the power shift. I had stepped into their world, and they had no idea what they were up against. That night, as I retreated to my apartment across the street, I allowed myself a small, triumphant smile. The first move had been made. The game was no longer theoretical, it was real. And as I plotted the next step, I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, the kind that comes only when one knows the enemy has underestimated them entirely. This was only the beginning. The days after my first encounter with David passed like a slow-moving storm. Each morning I awoke to the sounds of the city, distant car horns, children laughing somewhere blocks away, and the quiet hum of life I no longer fully belonged to. Yet my mind was far from the calm streets. It circled endlessly around the mansion, around David, Karen, and Mandy, around every betrayal that had pushed me to this point. I had tasted fear, and now I was determined to dish it back tenfold. I had always believed that revenge was not a matter of brute force, but of patience, observation, calculation, and yet I never imagined how exhausting it would be to sit in the shadows, notebook in hand, waiting for opportunity to reveal itself. Every creak in the house, every flicker of a light, every faint whisper behind a closed door became a signal, a piece of the puzzle. I was invisible to them, but I was watching. David had begun to act differently. I could see it from my vantage point across the street, through the binoculars I had purchased online. The smug confidence he carried when he thought no one was looking had been replaced by an uneasy caution. He was packing more frequently, checking locks, peering nervously out windows. It gave me a strange satisfaction, knowing that my silent intrusion had left a mark. The first ripple in a wave I intended to build. Karen, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware, or so she thought. Her laughter still echoed from the balcony when I passed by at night, high and brittle like broken glass. I could hear her voice over the hum of the city, planning parties, inviting friends, rearranging my home with her careless hands. And Mandy, she was the most dangerous of all. Always whispering, always suggesting, always planting the seeds of chaos. I had to watch them both closely to understand the dynamics of their alliances. I spent days mapping every routine. When the courier arrived, how long they stayed, the exact time Karen took her morning walks, David's nightly check of the security system, Mandy's penchant for leaving doors unlocked. Every detail, no matter how trivial, became ammunition for the plan I was crafting. Revenge was not about rage, it was about control. And soon I would take back control of what was mine. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One evening a storm rolled through the city, lightning slicing the sky and thunder shaking the windows. I had been observing the mansion from a nearby cafe, sipping coffee while pretending to read a newspaper, when I noticed a figure slipping through the side gate. It was a maintenance worker, young, distracted, careless. He didn't notice me crouched behind a hedge, rain dripping from my coat. I could see it, the back door was unlocked. My pulse quickened. I waited until the night deepened, until the mansion was silent except for the storm's roar. Slipping through the shadows, I approached the side entrance. The scent of wet earth and roses filled my nostrils, and I shivered, not from the cold but from the rush of adrenaline. Once inside, the familiar walls wrapped around me like a long-lost friend. I touched the banister of the grand staircase, feeling the grooves worn smooth by decades of footsteps. This house was mine. And soon, those who thought they could claim it would learn the cost of underestimating me. I moved cautiously, as always. My first task was to leave subtle reminders of my presence, small things barely noticeable yet enough to unsettle them. A misplaced book, a slightly ajar cabinet, a whisper of perfume that I had never used but could mimic. I wanted them to know without a doubt that I had returned. It was during one of these excursions that I discovered the first crack in their armor. David had left a window unlocked on the second floor, a mistake that could only have come from overconfidence or distraction. I smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of my lips, and made my way upstairs. The corridor smelled faintly of expensive cologne and lavender soap, a combination that made my stomach turn. Yet I felt alive, more alive than I had in years. In David's study, I found a stack of papers, documents that revealed how deeply he had manipulated the sale of the mansion. There were signatures I recognized, letters I had never seen, and evidence that Karen and Mandy had been complicit at every turn. My eyes scanned every line, every number, every scribble. The betrayal was deeper than I had imagined, and that depth only fueled my resolve. But it wasn't just about the mansion anymore. It was about pride, about legacy, about justice, and I was willing to play a long game. I spent the next few days carefully planting seeds of doubt among them. A subtle note slipped under the door, a shadow glimpsed from the staircase, a faint sound at the edge of the night. They began to suspect, to question each other, and I watched with satisfaction as their alliances frayed like old rope. Then came the night of the confrontation. I had waited for weeks, meticulously planning, observing, calculating every risk. The storm returned, heavier than before, lightning illuminating the mansion in stark flashes, thunder rattling the windows like the drums of war. I knew they would be gathered in the living room, David, Karen, Mandy, celebrating their perceived victory, oblivious to the predator in their midst. I entered through the back again, silent as a shadow, each step measured, deliberate. I could hear their voices, see the flicker of candlelight on their faces. They laughed, drank, and whispered plans, unaware of the storm that had already entered their home. I positioned myself behind the heavy velvet curtains, watching, waiting. My heart pounded, but not with fear, with anticipation. The first moment of panic came when a candle tipped over, smoke curling into the air. Karen shrieked, her voice piercing the night, and David jumped, knocking over his glass. Mandy grabbed her arm, and in that instant I revealed myself, not with violence but with presence. I stepped from the shadows, my coat wet from the rain, eyes sharp, voice calm yet carrying an undeniable authority. "Enjoying your victory?" I asked, letting the silence stretch. "Or do you prefer the idea that I am gone, that I am powerless?" David stammered, his confidence crumbling. Karen and Mandy froze, their eyes wide with shock, disbelief, and beneath it all fear. I did not move closer. I let them stew in the knowledge that I had returned, fully in control, fully aware. Fear is a weapon more powerful than anger, more effective than rage. And I wielded it with precision. They tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but I would not allow them words. Words were cheap. Action was the language I understood. I let the storm outside become a backdrop to my declaration. "This house, this life, this legacy, it is mine," I said, voice rising over the thunder. "And you will understand the cost of betrayal." That night I left them shaken, uncertain, and fractured. I did not need to strike with force. I did not need to make threats. My presence, my return, was enough to sow doubt and fear. And as I stepped into the rain once more, retreating to my safe observation point, I realized that the game had only just begun. Revenge is not a single strike. It is a series of carefully placed moves, a dance of shadows and light, a battle of patience and cunning. And I, Helen, at 73, was ready to play it better than anyone ever imagined. The weeks that followed my return to the mansion were a relentless blur of observation, planning, and silent maneuvers. Each day brought new challenges, new revelations, and a constant awareness that David, Karen, and Mandy were not idle. They had begun to suspect, yes, but suspicion is only dangerous if it is directed wisely. I had no intention of giving them the satisfaction of knowing the full extent of my strategy. They were pawns in my hands, and the game had only just begun. I spent the mornings in careful study of their routines, taking notes in a small, leather-bound journal that I carried everywhere. Every glance, every hesitation, every subtle change in behavior was catalogued. David had become increasingly erratic, packing through the grand halls late into the night, double-checking locks and alarms. Karen had begun to leave the house more frequently, as if the outside world could provide solace from the storm she had unwittingly invited into her home. And Mandy. She was the most dangerous yet predictable. Always whispering, always interfering, always leaving behind the tiny clues that made her easily manipulated. I needed leverage, something concrete to ensure that my presence was not just psychological but undeniable. One rainy afternoon, I discovered the safe in David's study, a hidden compartment behind an old painting that I had once hung myself decades ago. I had memorized the layout of this house in my sleep, and finding the safe was almost too easy. Inside were documents, contracts, and letters that detailed every secret transaction David had made to sell the mansion, every deceitful manipulation, every whispered promise broken. The betrayal ran deeper than I had imagined, and the realization stoked the fire that burned inside me. It was time to escalate. I began leaving subtle messages, invisible at first, hints of my movements. A book pulled from the shelf, a drawer slightly open, a note in a handwriting that was deliberately not mine. Fear is a slow-growing vine, creeping through the mind until the victim is paralyzed. and it was working. They began to question each other, their alliance crumbling under the weight of suspicion. The tension inside the mansion became almost palpable, like a live wire ready to snap. Then came the confrontation I had been waiting for. I had learned that David planned to meet with a lawyer in the city late one night, a secret meeting he believed would finalize his grip on the estate. I followed him, remaining in the shadows, every step deliberate, every breath measured. The streets were wet from the rain, reflections of neon lights shimmering like fractured glass. I stayed out of sight, watching, waiting, and when the moment was right, I made my move, not with violence but with the precision of someone who understood the power of fear. David entered a small, nearly empty office, confident and unaware. I slipped inside moments later, unseen, my coat dripping, my presence a silent storm. He froze, sensing rather than seeing me. "Helen," his voice trembled, disbelief and fear mingling. What are you doing here?" I smiled, not with warmth but with calculated intent. "I've been here all along, David," I said. "Watching, listening, learning. And now you're going to understand the cost of betrayal." He swallowed hard, fumbling for words, but I let the silence stretch. Fear is louder than any scream, heavier than any chain, and David felt it now, the weight of his own misdeeds pressing down. Returning to the mansion, I realized it was time to broaden my strategy. Karen and Mandy had begun to suspect more than I anticipated. I had to strike carefully, planting evidence, orchestrating moments that would make them doubt themselves, doubt each other. One evening I left a letter addressed to Mandy, hinting that Karen was conspiring against her, playing their own fears against them. Within hours, Mandy confronted Karen, their argument echoing through the empty halls like thunder. I watched from the shadows, the thrill of manipulation coursing through me. The mansion, once a place of comfort, had become a stage for my vengeance. Every room, every corner, every creaking floorboard became part of the narrative I was writing. I was no longer the 73-year-old woman they had underestimated. I was the architect of their fear, the invisible hand that would guide their downfall. And yet, even as I reveled in my growing control, I knew that the most dangerous moments were yet to come. David, desperate and cornered, began making rash decisions. Karen, paranoid and defensive, started to falter in her interactions. Mandy, the instigator, became increasingly reckless. Each misstep they made was an opportunity, a thread I could pull to unravel the web of deceit they had spun around themselves. One night a thunderstorm raged over the city, lightning illuminating the mansion in stark, fleeting flashes. I moved through the halls with precision, placing small deliberate traps, nothing that could harm them physically but enough to create uncertainty, to plant seeds of paranoia. A door left slightly ajar, a note suggesting betrayal, a shadow flickering across a hallway at the right moment. By the time they realized anything was amiss, fear had already taken root. The climax of the week came unexpectedly. David, in a panic over a missing document I had hidden in plain sight, confronted Karen and Mandy in the grand dining room. Voices rose, accusations flew, and the tension reached a breaking point. I watched silently from the upper balcony, unseen, my heart pounding with anticipation. They were unraveling, every lie exposed, every secret whispered too loudly. And all I had done was exist in the space between shadow and reality, guiding them to their own downfall. By the end of the night, the mansion was silent again, but not in the way it had been when I first returned. Silence now carried a new weight, a tense, fragile pause after chaos, the quiet that follows the storm. I had established my presence, my power, and my strategy. They feared me, though they did not fully understand why. And fear, as I knew, is the most effective weapon of all. As I stepped into the cool night air, rain mixing with the faint scent of roses, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. This chapter of the game was over, but the war was far from finished. David, Karen, and Mandy had underestimated me, and they would continue to do so, until it was too late. Revenge is not about immediate gratification. It is about patience, precision, and the relentless pursuit of justice. And I, Helen, 73 and underestimated, was only just beginning. The mansion had become a battlefield of shadows, whispers, and fear. Weeks of careful planning, subtle manipulations, and psychological games had brought me to this point. I, Helen, at 73, was no longer the frail grandmother they had underestimated. I was a force, an unseen predator, and tonight, the final act of this drama would prove it. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside me. Thunder rolled like a drum, lightning illuminating the mansion in violent flashes. Every detail had been orchestrated. David's pride, Karen's paranoia, Mandy's recklessness, all laid bare. The traps I had set, the subtle messages, the invisible presence, They had been enough to break their unity, to make them doubt themselves and each other. I entered through the side gate, unseen and silent. The rain soaked through my coat, but I felt nothing but exhilaration. I moved through the familiar halls, now my kingdom of shadows. Every step, every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight was part of my choreography. Tonight, they would finally understand the consequences of betrayal. David was first. I had lured him to the library with a carefully planted note, promising proof of my return and a chance to reclaim the mansion. He arrived anxious, fumbling with the envelope I had left for him. The moment his hands touched it, I appeared from the shadows. His face went pale. "You," he stammered, fear finally breaking through his arrogance. "You're how?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I let the silence stretch, the kind of silence that presses on the chest, makes the heart race, makes the mind race with fear. Then I spoke, voice calm, deliberate, carrying authority and precision. "You thought I was gone. You thought 73 years meant weakness. But age does not diminish cunning, David, and betrayal is a lesson best learned in fear." His hands trembled. I let my gaze sweep over him like a judge pronouncing sentence. "Look at what you've done," I said, pointing to the scattered papers, the contracts, the false signatures, the proof of your deceit. "You sold what wasn't yours to sell. You betrayed the blood that raised you, and now you will face the consequences." Fear is contagious. David's voice cracked, Karen's laughter faltered, Mandy's whispers became frantic. I had orchestrated every moment leading to this confrontation, yet I knew the ultimate reckoning required patience. I let them stew in their guilt, their panic, until it consumed them entirely. The next phase was Karen. She had been the social manipulator, the one who smiled while others faltered, who wove deception with elegance. I had left a series of accidental hints, carefully guiding her paranoia until she finally confronted Mandy. Their argument had fractured them already, but now it was time to strike decisively. I appeared behind Karen as she stormed into the hallway, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Helen," she gasped, voice trembling. I don't understand. How?" "Understand this," I interrupted, voice sharp, unwavering. "Every move you made against me, every whisper you thought I wouldn't hear, every deceit you plotted, you will pay for it." She froze. For the first time I saw true fear in her eyes. Not shock, not anger, not disbelief, but the raw, suffocating fear of someone who knows their life is no longer their own. Mandy was the final piece. She had been the instigator, the one who had planted seeds of greed and ambition, who had encouraged David, who had whispered in Karen's ear. I had been saving her for last, letting the chaos of the past weeks weaken her, ensuring she would be the most vulnerable when I finally confronted her. I found her in the grand dining room, frantic, packing, unable to comprehend how the tide had turned. She tried to speak, to plead, but her words fell flat against the storm of her own realization. I stepped into her path, rain dripping from my coat, eyes sharp, voice cold and commanding. "Mandy, do you see now? The web you helped weave has trapped you as tightly as it trapped David and Karen. You underestimated me, and underestimation is costly." She stammered, fear overwhelming her, but I didn't need her words. I only needed her acknowledgement of defeat, her realization that she was no longer in control. And as the storm outside mirrored the chaos within, I felt a strange sense of exhilaration. Revenge is not about violence, it is about precision, awareness, and timing. And tonight, every detail had aligned. I guided them to the grand hall where the chandelier swayed above, flickering as the storm lashed against the windows. Each lightning flash illuminated their faces, the fear, the panic, the realization of their betrayal. I let them feel it, absorb it, until it became unbearable. Then I spoke, slowly, deliberately. "This mansion, this legacy is mine. Every brick, every beam, every memory. It belongs to those who built it, who loved it, who respected it. You have taken what was not yours, and you have learned the cost of that choice." I let the silence stretch again, allowing my words to settle into their minds, rooting doubt and regret deeply. And then finally I revealed the final piece, the evidence of their crimes, hidden in plain sight, documented and irrefutable. David's signature, Karen's manipulations, Mandy's instigations, all laid bare. They sank into chairs, unable to speak, unable to move, consumed by the weight of their own actions. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if acknowledging the culmination of events within these walls. I walked among them, my presence commanding, every step measured, every glance deliberate. I was not the 73-year-old they had dismissed, I was the reckoning itself. Hours passed in silence, the storm outside finally retreating, leaving only the echo of rain against the windows. The mansion, once a battleground, became a place of reflection, of acknowledgement, of realization. They understood now, too late, that their greed, their deception, and their betrayal had led them to this moment. And as I stood in the center of the grand hall, looking at what I had orchestrated, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Not revenge in the petty sense, not vengeance driven by rage, but justice, delivered with precision, patience, and control. I had reclaimed what was mine. I had reminded them, and myself, of the power that age, experience, and cunning could wield. The mansion was quiet now, peaceful in a way that was earned, not given. David, Karen, and Mandy would carry the memory of this night with them forever, a reminder of the consequences of underestimating someone they thought was fragile, someone they thought was done. I, Helen, 73, had not just returned to my home. I had reclaimed my life, my legacy, my dignity. And in that reclamation I discovered something profound: the strength to endure, the power to strategize, and the wisdom to wield fear as a tool rather than a weapon. As I walked through the halls, touching the familiar walls, the furniture, the memories etched into every corner, I allowed myself a quiet smile. The storm had passed. The reckoning had been delivered. And I finally could breathe again, knowing that the mansion, my sanctuary, my legacy, was safe once more.